Welcome to Timeless with Julie Hartman Live. It is Wednesday, June 12th, 2024. I'm Julie Hartman, and it is great, as always, to be with you. 844-861-5537 is the call-in number, 844-861-5537. But as always, you can use the chat as long as you keep it classy. I see that we have someone already in the chat from Northern California. Hello to you too, Stephen. Nice to have you here. I want to start off this show by hello to another Dean. Nice to see you too, Dean. I feel like if someone else then writes in, I gotta be equal opportunity with my hellos here in to the chat. Speaking of equal opportunity with hellos, before my story, hi, Sean.
Sup, Jules?
Great to be with you. Always great to be with you,
today's
Sean.
a doozy.
Today's a doozy. Yes. Well, I want to tell a quick story that I think will really set the scene for this great episode today. And then, Sean, you can cut in and talk about some of the crazy news stories that we're seeing. But as many of you know, I am a recent graduate of Harvard University. That's my new joke that I'm telling people. I start with the H and they think they know where I'm going, but they really don't. And graduated 2 years ago, and I was a history major. And one of the classes that I took, which looked really appealing to me and so useful for not just my career, but for my life, was 20th century American history. And I was in that class. I could tell so many stories from that class, but I'll tell you one. One day I was in that course and we were going over the Ronald Reagan presidency. And by the way, important to note, because it just kind of colors the whole education experience, I was on Zoom taking that course because, they sent us home for an entire year because of a virus that they lied came from a bat. And then they, went crazy with the lockdowns and sent healthy kids like me at home to do Zoom school from our childhood bedrooms for a year. Yeah, let's not forget that. So I'm on Zoom and they're putting up the slides of the Reagan presidency. And I remember Ronald Reagan's presidency in this course was reduced to about 3 bullet points, and all 3 of them were negative. And one of them, predictably and of course, was that he exacted this war on drugs and war on what do they call it? Of course, I'm now forgetting. It's war on drugs or war on poverty or no, war on poverty is a positive thing. Well, I forget their big buzzwords, but it was basically like Ronald Reagan incarcerated all of these black people. Okay, that's essentially the point. And so I raised my little hand on Zoom, the Zoom hand feature, hand raise, and I cut in as, the closet conservative of the class. And I said, hi, I'm so sorry to, interrupt your whole anti-conservative, anti-Reagan spiel, but I just wanted to cut in and ask a question. Does he get any credit for the Star Wars program? Some of what he did during the Cold War to, help engineer the end of the Cold War. Does he get any credit for that? Does he get any credit for supporting and backing the Contras in Nicaragua or the rebels in El Salvador against communist evils? Any credit for that? Any credit for the fact that when he entered office, there was double-digit inflation, and thanks to his great economic policies, very practical but great, he got inflation down and facilitated steered our country towards more of an economic boom. No credit for anything, right? So I'd raise my hand and I say some of that, of course, in a more gracious way than I'm saying it to you now. And my professor just kind of gives this very placid, well, everybody's interpretation of the Reagan years are different. I'm like, okay, of course. We're doing the your truth, my truth thing. Of course. So my whole reason for telling you this story is to introduce our guest today, who is so cool. He is Professor Wilfred Riley. He's an associate professor of political science at Kentucky State University. And yesterday, he released a book, which I think is one of the most important of our time. I read some of it last night. And of course, I forgot the book. I left it at my apartment. I would have brought the in-person copy here, but I read some of it. It is so great. Let's put up a picture. It's called Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me: Debunking the False Narratives Defining America's School Curricula. And it's so brilliant because each chapter, Professor Riley profiles just one of those lies and goes through and debunks the lie. It's spectacular. I'll just give you some of the lies, although you just heard one of them from my Harvard 20th Century American History class. Professor Riley talks about, and I'm reading directly here from Amazon because I cite my sources, the Red Scare was a moral panic that caught no commies. That's such a great one. Another one, European colonialism was empirically a no good, terrible, very bad thing. So true. My God, the amount of times I was told that one. The racist Southern strategy turned the South Republican. OMG, I did an episode on this about a year ago where I debunked the party swap myth because I was taught in my 10th grade American history class that the Democrat and Republican parties just switched in the 1960s after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. That's crazy. So you just, the Republican Party was the party of fighting against the evils of slavery. The Democratic Party was the party trying to preserve it. You just went through this whole Civil War. And then all of a sudden, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, you just decide to switch. Doesn't make any sense. And as Professor Riley debunks, and as I debunked in my episode, you know who overwhelmingly voted for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in Congress, proportional to the number of representatives? It wasn't Democrats, it was Republicans. I'll read you one more. The Vietnam War was unpopular and pointless. Exactly, another liberal lie. Sean had some news stories that I just want him to read super fast before we get to our guest, because part of the craziness that we're seeing in our country right now is because students have been taught these lies for generations, and then they enter the government, enter positions of power, journalism, and the whole sludge machine keeps churning. Sean, could you just quickly read the headlines that you read to me before the show?
Yeah, well, the number one story in the country is Russian warships have arrived in Cuba as a show of force. Hunter Biden. Hezbollah terrorists launch massive rocket attack on Israel.
Great.
And the Federal Reserve leaves key interest rate unchanged amid signs of inflation.
Great. So we're doing real well. Well, the rot starts in our schools and it's continuing in our schools. And that's why I am so honored to welcome Professor Riley to the show. Hi, Professor Riley. Nice to meet you.
How are you?
Live on the show. I'm good, thanks. Thank you for coming on and for writing this book. It's so necessary, as we know. So, gosh, this is what I want to do is profile some of these lies, and maybe we'll do 2 or 3 of what you would deem the biggest and most consequential. But first, tell us a bit about your background. Were you always aware of the lies that were being funneled at you? And if not, when did you wake up to them?
Well, no, not really. I mean, I think that most people in the kind of middle to upper middle class America begin as sort of conventional liberals. And that's in large part because of what I'm talking about here. I mean, when you look at the educational system, when you look at the media, there's an incredible slant in one direction. I mean, Pew in 2004, Pew Research, this was replicated again in, I think, 2011, looked at the preferences of national media journalists and found that only about 7% of them were on the right. So that includes kind of the center right, all the wacky fun guy libertarians, really everybody. The other 93% were Marxists, liberals, or left-leaning moderates. And it's pretty much the same thing in college. I mean, you have entire fields like sociology that lean, 99, 97% to the left. So I think that when most people get out of, I didn't go Ivy, but I mean, I graduated from the University of Illinois, kind of Big Ten school. When most people get out of a typical American college, you'd have sort of default positions like abortion. Oh, well, that's a women's issue. You know, militarization. Well, wouldn't it be great if the schools got the funding they needed and the army had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber, this sort of thing. And I mean, gradually after undergraduate school, I went to grad school, worked in the business world. And like most people, I think and at least this used to be the case pre-DEI and so on, as you go into normal life, you start seeing that a lot of the things you were told don't make a lot of sense. I mean, if you're doing pretty well financially, half your salary is being taken away, and you realize you're not necessarily, I'm a Chicagoan by background, you're not necessarily getting a lot in exchange for that. You're not exactly getting a very functional, crime-free, kind of even Norwegian society. When you look around at crime policy, immigration policy, you realize that a lot of that doesn't seem to be working very well. That it wouldn't really be all that hard for it to work. You could just lock up or kill criminals and then there'd be less crime. So, I mean, traditionally, the progression is you move away from kind of conventional leftism, and I did. But because I'm a nerd, I'm a wonk, I went on, and while I was working in that kind of sales and trading floor sector, more on the sales side for me, I was going toward a PhD, and I was continuing to read academic content. And by this point, it just struck me that a lot of this stuff was BS. A lot of it was watered down variations on communism. So, I mean, critical race theory is the Marxist conspiratorial vision of the world, but with the rich man replaced with the white man. You know, fourth wave feminism is, yeah, well, it's all the same thing, right? Like fourth wave feminism is the Marxist vision. You know, the facially neutral world is set up to oppress you, but with the rich man replaced with the man. And queer theory is the rich man replaced with, I guess, the straight man, and so on down the line. And I started looking into these texts and a lot of the things we were being told. And this book really gets into some depth. Like, for example, the idea that slavery is unique to the West, the idea that Native Americans were peaceful and feminist, the idea that the West was in the wrong during the Cold War, that white flight, quote unquote, this was also middle-class black flight, which is how my family ended up spending some time in the suburbs, but that was caused by racism as opposed to crime and rioting. Like a lot of those things that are canonical, again, in the group in society where most people with college degrees come from, those seem to just be nonsensically wrong. So I started looking up these sort of older sources and wrote a book about this.
So glad you did. And what you've just said about the neo-Marxism is on the nose. You know, if you also, what people don't acknowledge is that the founders, for instance, of BLM, they brag about their Marxism. Someone like Susan Stryker, who's one of the founders of queer theory, literally writes about the fact that a transgender body is a weapon against, you know, the heteronormative family structure. Many of the founders of these theories, which have leached into the mainstream of our education, are quite overt and open with their agendas. So you're totally right in saying that, you know, in the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, it's sort of a racial take on the proletariat rebelling against the bourgeoisie. It's totally true. Also, though, these individuals who are behind it brag about the fact that this is what they're doing. So it's very overt. So let's go into some of these lies. I have some of my favorites that I know were especially pummeled at me, but I'd like to ask you, what do you think out of all the ones that you identified? And you did how many? 11, right? 11 or 12 in your book?
Well, it's 10, and then there's
10.
a bonus. The bonus is kind of just the same stuff going on today.
Yes.
So I did a follow-up chapter about some of the things Black Lives Matter said. I even threw the quote-unquote alt-right in there, but the idea of systemic racism, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh, no, I skimmed it last night. As I said, I'm so sorry I didn't bring it in person, but I have your book. It's really great. What are out of the 10 that you identified, what would you say are the top 2 or 3 that are really the most propagated and the most damaging?
Well, I think that there are two kind of big historic ones that I focus on. And then, I mean, maybe the Southern strategy example that you mentioned would be a good example of something more modern. But the historic ones that have probably gotten the most attention are chapter one. Slavery wasn't something unique to the United States or to the West. I read recently that 40% of American kids, this is true among whites and blacks, think that only the USA ever had slaves, which is crazy. I mean, there's a famous movie called Gladiator that I remember watching with my buddies in college. You know, if you lost a war to the Romans, you wound up in the arena, you know, fighting lions and tigers with a stick. You know, so slavery, there actually is almost a deep element to this. Slave was one of the first 20 or so human words. And the Sumerian glyph for slave literally means defeated warrior. It's the word for person from a mountain city. Obviously, the Sumerians, the Akkadians were the people on the plains, and there were smaller but civilized cities on the way up the hills, the Zagros or whatever. And the people would fight. This is Sargon of Akkad, this era. And so a slave was just someone from the mountains who was captured. And this word, this glyph endured for thousands of years and became one of the first things we recognize in human language. And we went from there to the Greeks, where Aristotle argued that Persians and barbarians, fortunately enough for him, were natural slaves. The Romans had 15% of the empire was composed of slaves. The Arabs and the blacks used to take each other as slaves constantly. The Zanj Wars is a legendary conflict between those peoples. There was a slave trade in whites, the Barbary slave trade, where African masters took about 2.5 million whites into slavery. That's now been forgotten entirely for ideological reasons. So, I mean, just all of this went on for all of human history. The only thing unique, really, that the white countries, when Europe got into the civilizational race a bit late after Columbus, but, you know, did it better than anyone else prior to that point. But I mean, the only thing that the European Christians did that was really unique was in slavery. I mean, after several hundred years of trading along with everyone else, the emancipation movement began in England and France, and the slave trade was ended within 300 to 400 years. So that point, I think, is something that absolutely shocks a lot of people that have read the book. To me, it's just sort of conventional historical knowledge. Like I'm moving on toward 40 now. I learned that in school. We still talked about Lincoln as the great emancipator and so on. But that seems to have been totally cut out of a lot of curricula today. That not only did the West not uniquely engage in slavery, but the Westerners, the white Europeans, freed the slaves.
Could I pause you right
3.
there? No, I'm so sorry. I have a rule that I never interrupt guests. I'm going to break that rule now, just because I do want to hear more of the lies that you think are the most important. But I have to ask you this question. It's so true. And I was seeing this for my whole educational life, that we are taught that maybe if they don't say it overtly, they communicate it to us by concealing the other instances of slavery. We are taught that America was the only country that had slavery, essentially. That is the impression that we get. Now, I do a lot of reading, and I've done a lot of shows, Professor Riley, on other countries and the way that they teach their students about their history. And we look at a place like communist China, or we look at a place like Putin's Russia, and they will lie about their past, but in a glorious way. They will, they will make their past out to be they will whitewash the details of their barbarism, both past and present, in the name of this triumphant, narrative. I mean, in communist China, they essentially propagate this idea that they're the center of the world and that China has been the most advanced civilization in human history. Why is it that regimes such as China and Russia, which frankly have far more to be embarrassed about than we do, teach their history in this victorious way, but then here in the United States, we have far less to be embarrassed about, but then we leech onto these moments in our past and we don't teach the next generation of kids to love this country?
Because the Chinese and the Russians are healthier than we are in that respect. I mean, I think it was Nietzsche that pointed out that, I mean, he's often critiqued as having hated Christianity. He actually didn't feel exactly that way, but he said that the one great weakness of Western religion was an excessive focus on empathy as opposed to the other more
Totally.
martial virtues.
Yes.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that if you look at the 9 heroic virtues of men, according to the Stoics and the Vikings and the Iroquois, what Christianity added was something that was absolutely needed that didn't exist prior to that, which was mercy or empathy. But you can't have mercy or empathy alone. You now need the 10 or 11 virtues. And I mean, Aquinas and Christian theologians openly said that. We now, as we move to a softer Christianity or through Christianity in the West, often seem to be focused on empathy alone. This is something that I've called prey morality in essays, that the worst thing you can do is advantage yourself and your wife and your friends. And the best thing you can do is be as empathic as possible to people that hate you. So the Chinese and the Russians, who come out of their own highly civilized systems, Buddhism and Orthodox Christianity, don't feel that way. They still have the traditional virtues that are very similar to what we used to have. So, I mean, in all honesty, and we've both been leaders, like if you're going to train people, I think the truth is best. But second best, yes, would be noble lies about how great you are.
Yes.
The worst, I mean, come on, it's a boot camp.
So
Think
true.
about the Marines. Think about what your coach tells you. You know, like the worst possible thing you could do is tell people lies about how bad they are.
It's so true.
You guys are never going downstate. Like, I don't mean to make fun of this, but it's just unbelievably asinine. So I think that the Chinese and the Russian school system probably has an edge over us in that respect. We have been infiltrated to some extent by people that are heavily influenced by external foreign actors that dislike this society. And this, last line for me, but I'm good friends with people like James Lindsay. I've met him in person a lot. I like him as a personal buddy. But I think on the right, there's often a little too much focus on theory. You know, like this is what Foucault said versus what Rousseau said. I think that there is also kind of a core practical financial element to a lot of this stuff. There are people from organized left-wing activist movements that are very much a part of the educational curriculum in the United States by this point. I'm sure James is aware of this as well. But they're teaching people in the USA that they shouldn't like the country that much. And that's having exactly the effect you'd expect it to. So, I mean, probably a point to the Chinese on that one.
Boy, I have to tell you, we really are kindred spirits, because if I were asked the question that I asked you, I would have answered the same way that you did. It's absolutely right. We've done shows here on Nietzsche. I've welcomed Spencer Clavin onto the show. We have this Thinker of the Month series, and we profiled Nietzsche. And I call him both brilliant and devious. But he really is so on the nose in that sometimes he goes too far, but he says about Christianity, you know, what kind of religion would put their God on the cross and you know, lionize victimhood in that way. Now, I don't view Christianity that way. I think Christianity is a beautiful thing, and it is a credit to Christianity that God came down and suffered alongside us and made the ultimate sacrifice with humanity. But also, two things can be true at once. That's a beautiful story, but also there are elements of Christianity, and I'm saying this as someone who's exploring religion myself and perhaps is a Christian. There are elements of Christianity which, if not put in its proper place, can go too far. Victimhood, mercy, empathy. And that's exactly right, that our culture right now, I think, has so internalized these things that they've become perverse parodies of themselves. But also, yes, it's terrible that we have this domestic threat, but also it's being facilitated by foreign threats who seek to undermine and subvert the United States, and they're doing it, that's right, through our school system. How, you know, I've profiled Yuri Bezmenov on this show and the 4 steps of ideological subversion. How did this all happen, though? Like, how did the Soviet Union and Chinese Communist Party and others decide upon subverting the United States? And how did they really get there? Like, how are the teachers' unions now, for instance, bought off? What's the link? Do you know? How'd they make it happen?
I'm not sure how much of a formal link there is. I mean, one of the great weaknesses of the USA is that we're a very open society.
Yeah.
So, I mean, chapter two of this book is actually about espionage. And I mean, you read this out and broke it down. I mean, the lie is that the Red Scare was a panic that caught no communists. And that, again, is an insanity level fiction. So as a political scientist, I mean, I've actually looked at the Venona cables, which are the decrypted exchanges between Russia and her agents during World War II and the Cold War, as you know. So since we were friendly with, Mr. Putin after the collapse of the USSR through the late 1990s, early 00s, the USA was able to obtain most of that information. So if you just go to Britannica or Wikipedia and look up Venona, Venona cables, you can see a list of the Ruski agents that were in the USA at that time. And I'm sure they've kept a couple of them encrypted, the actual Russian citizens they cared about and so on. But what you can see is that most of the people that were left-wing cause celebs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Alger Hiss, all these people, were actual Russian spies. The Russians have admitted this for the past 30 years. They've apologized for a few of them. So, all right, is this working for me?
It is, yeah. You're still here on my end. Oh no. There he goes. Okay, we can get him back. In the meantime, I'll look here as I tell you about MyPillow. As many of you know, I use a lot of MyPillow products. I sleep on a MyPillow. I sleep on the Giza Dream bed sheets. I use my towels and I wear my slippers. And you can get these products at a discount too if you use the promo code Hartman. And right now, MyPillow is having a $25 extravaganza, which is just what it sounds like. You can get MyPillow sandals for $25, 2-pack multi-use MyPillows, $25, 6-pack towel sets for $25, brand new 4-pack dish towels for $25, and for the first time ever, the premium MyPillows with all new Giza fabric, just $25. Orders over $75 will receive free shipping. Just go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Hartman or call 1-800-566-6745 today and use the promo code Hartman. I don't know if we have Professor Riley back, but if we don't, that's fine. Where do you see people who are alive? Again, get them behind the scenes. You want me here or you want me here? Stay here? Good. Anywhere I am, you can listen. But what Professor Riley was just saying is so true about part of this is, yes, there are massive, foreign campaigns to subvert the United States institutionally. And we've done Yuri Bezmenov on the show as an example. But also, we have such an open society. And one of the great things about free speech is that we're allowed to speak. But one of the downsides about free speech is that any idea can be advocated for. And instead of keeping free speech in its proper place, in my view, we've allowed these ideas, which should be allowed to be spoken, to be endorsed and legitimized. That's my take on it. And we have Professor Riley back. Great. That was a relatively harmless, seamless drop-off for a live show. Good to have you back. You were saying, do you remember where you were? Or?
Yeah, I remember exactly where I was. Yeah, so, we had some flicker of power here. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but yeah, good to be back on the air. So yeah, in the United States, we're a totally open society. So during the Venona period, the country was riddled with Russian spies. The idea that this is something that was made up by the right wing to panic people, that's simply not accurate. Mm-hmm. So today, I don't necessarily know if the majority of the people that seem to be acting against the interests of the country are, I don't think the majority of them are foreign agents, certainly. That's a little paranoid. Some of them might be assets in the sense that they're people that other countries would keep an interested eye on or would funnel money to. I mean, that it's a running joke that when you see, for example, the pro-Hamas protests that we've seen on college campuses, including Harvard's recently, there seems to be a substantial amount of cash flow into them so that everyone has the same $300 tent from REI and so on. And that stuff like that goes on at a much higher level as you move up into think tanks and into other institutions. But whether or not people have any connection to external players, the reality is that you can simply pick up the ideas that come from any institution, any religion, any nation around the world in the USA and express them here. So that's a weakness to some extent that we have that many of our opponents, China, Saudi Arabia, so on, simply don't.
Mm-hmm.
There's a corresponding strength that comes with it, but it's something that we have to be very aware of.
Yep. That's right. It's like, enjoying food. If you enjoy food too much, you can get a little corpulent. Anything has to be kept in its proper place, including our freedom and our openness. Who was it? I want to give proper attribution. Someone said, next to the Statue of Liberty, we should have a Statue of Responsibility. And I always loved that line. So what are the other, you started off with slavery, started off the book and started off this interview with the slavery lie. What's one other one? And again, Professor Riley's book profiles 10 plus a bonus. But what would you say is one other one that is just as pervasive and damaging as the slavery one?
I think that if I were going to move into one of the more modern era lies, the most interesting one, I think, is chapter 4, which essentially is the 1960s were bad. So, I mean, if you break it down in order, it's everyone hated hippies. The sexual and drug revolutions were mostly bad, especially for women. And the Vietnam War was not pointless and defeat could have been avoided. And I sort of go blow by blow through that. And the idea, I think, in certainly the minds of many people who came of age in that generation, the baby boomers, if you will, and that then went on to become the yuppies and that still lionize this period. We have new books about it that come out every year. This is viewed as sort of a golden era. I mean, I remember John Kerry when he was running against Mr. Bush, striding across the stage and shouting, we came of age in the greatest period for America. We said we would change the world. And then he actually screams, and we did. That's kind of the take on this time. And obviously there were good things. I mean, the early portion of the feminist movement, you can get a checking account, basic Black civil rights that came out of this era. But when I started researching more into it as someone who grew up a bit later, I was born in 1981. Much of it was almost entirely negative. I mean, the anti-nuke movement, which in my opinion has killed millions of people, and the sort of general eco-freako movement around the world, the anti-natalist, almost anti-human movement. We're looking at below replacement birth rates. This is the biggest problem in the world, in most of the first world. The extremes of the sexual revolution, most of the STDs we have today, not to go on a bizarre sideline here, but didn't exist until relatively recently.
So true. You're welcome to go on any sideline you want. It's very useful.
But I remember when I was in high school, it began to affect the dating lives of myself and our group of friends that AIDS came to exist. These were things that were not problems for most of human history because humans were not behaving in ways that made them likely to be problematic.
That's right.
But I mean, going on from there, I mean, the drug revolution, the anti-war movement, which frankly did lose us Vietnam, the anti-draft movement, which, I mean, to some extent was frank national promotion of cowardice, where you were seeing young fighting men chant things like nothing is worth dying for, burning their military service cards. And this just went on and on and on. I mean, there were the Manson family, the Great Society. Like all of this, the Cultural Revolution in the USA was nearly as dramatic as the Cultural Revolution in China. And this occurred in a single period between maybe 1962 and 1978. So I talk about this in a chapter of the book, and I bring up a lot of things that I think are largely forgotten today. One of them is what the actual public attitude toward this was at the time. And it was intensely negative among most working and middle-class white and Black people. There were actual anti-hippie riots. I mean, most notably the Hard Hat riot in New York. where mobs of tens of thousands of men would get together and chase hippies out of public areas. Because the idea was sort of, you didn't want your wife and daughter seeing this. There were people being very intimate, let's say, in public. There were people setting American flags on fire, and citizens would en masse just get rid of them. The number one hit on the radio for 6 weeks running was "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee." So I talk about the actual public reaction. And then we get into Vietnam, which, I mean, was a tragic defeat.
Yes.
There wasn't some sort of glorious achievement for the American left in the USA pulling out of Vietnam. The result of the USA pulling out of Vietnam was the killing fields in Cambodia, where, 4 million people, many of them allies, were slaughtered. It was the fall of Saigon, where people were desperately attempting to evacuate from the roofs of buildings as helicopters flew away. It was the actual sack of a modern city. So all of this took place during a period where capitalism and communism were clashing globally. And the reason for the conflict in Vietnam was that we thought that victory there would help us fight successfully against the communists, which would have been the case. Our defeat had the opposite effect. So I think that's one of those very sweeping chapters that, without boasting too much about myself, contains a lot of information that many today may have forgotten.
Well, I understand that you wouldn't want to boast about yourself, but I can boast about you. It's true. Your book is so rich as far as the information it has, and debunking the main lies, and then within the main lie, mini lies that contribute to the overall lie. It's really just fantastic. So please, everyone, consider getting this book. I want to close our discussion today by just asking, what do you think the way out of this is? I mean, as you were speaking, I was just thinking, this is so deep and entrenched. I mean, it would be damaging enough if one of those 10 lies were taught and propagated in American public schools. But all 10 have been taught and propagated. And there are even lies that you didn't include in there, which will have to be a second book, There are so many. And I feel blessed that I saw the truth. And what I try to do is, to the best of my ability, alert others to the truth. But many in my generation and in younger generations are being so deeply brainwashed. I know it's kind of an impossible question, but do you see any substantial way out of this besides just people like you and me trying to alert people to the brainwash?
Well, I think the West is a society that faces some very serious existential problems, to be honest. Our opponents, like the Chinese and the Arabs, are the same opponents that the Western world has had for thousands of years. And by and large, they don't have the same pathologies that we do right now. And a lot of the things that I describe in this book are very, very deeply entrenched in our society. So the idea that we describe as wokeness isn't just some silly dorm room fantasy. It's actually a very serious quasi-religious ideology. And I would describe it as having sort of 3 core components. Component 1 would be all of the things in society that appear to be facially neutral are in fact set up to oppress. This is an old Marxist idea. And as one of us said earlier, in classical vulgar Marxism, society set up to oppress the poor, basically, the proletariat. And in the different critical theories, the group that is to be oppressed varies. So in CRT and the critical racial theories, it's blacks or whatever. And fourth wave feminism, it's women. And queer theory, it's sexual minorities. And this really varies, actually. Like, it goes on. There's an entire paradigm called fat studies, where the idea is that pretty well-off people are kind of the group that's supposed to run society. And I'm dead serious about this. There's a journal called Fat Studies that my buddy Peter Boghossian once hoaxed. So at any rate, I mean, but it's that they publish once a month of tens of thousands of readers. So it's the sort of nonsense you might think. They run articles about fat bodybuilding and so on. But at any rate, though, the point 1 is all of society looks facially neutral, but is set up to oppress you. A common fourth wave feminist argument, for example, is that marriage is an oppressive system designed to give men access to as much sex as possible. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense, but people take it very seriously. Point two is that you can tell that society is designed to oppress if there are any gaps in performance between groups. So, for example, if blacks and whites post different SAT scores, you can tell that the test is oppressive. The only possible explanations for the gap are genetic inferiority and some kind of racism in the design of the test. This might sound idiotic. You might say, well, couldn't black kids just study less? But this is literally like Ibram Kendi, Rich Delgado. This is the argument. It's pretty much canonical by this point. And third, the idea is that the solution is equity. So anytime you find disparities in performance, what you need to do is change society so that all groups are represented equally regardless of performance. And what's becoming increasingly prevalent as an idea is that this representation should take place not just along racial lines, but along sex lines, along orientational lines, and so on down the line. And this is a potentially society-destroying idea. If you Google major airlines blind pilots, because I don't just want to talk about this, it sounds so nonsensical, people think I'm lying, you'll see things like the major carriers trying to hire a proportionate number of disabled pilots, because the only reason these people are underrepresented has to be unfair discrimination against them. That's not actually a joke. So you have the core DEI idea moving through society in combination with all this other stuff we're talking about. We're the worst society ever, the most evil society ever. And in tandem, all of this stuff combined with declining religiosity, combined with the crazy belief that the world's about to end, leads to stuff like what I mentioned when it comes to fertility. So in the upper middle class, the average birth rate per two-person couple is, I think, 1.1 children. So we're literally not replacing ourselves. So the West has very, very real problems. I'm not necessarily a black-pilled guy, quote unquote, but these are very major issues that a lot of our opponents don't have. So what can you do? I think that the major point is just telling the truth. I think this book will be widely read without false modesty. I think it'll be a bestseller. I see tons of people. I had a conversation with Chris Rufo earlier today. He's doing good work on education. You are yourself. I mean, I see a lot of people responding to this. So normal taxpayers need to start speaking up and saying, well, you know, I think this point is obviously true. I'm going to publicly make it. I choose not to die. I think that there are a couple I'm going to close with very quickly 2 positive points. I think that there are 2 real advantages that sort of our side has. One, a lot of the points that we're making are extremely obvious and intuitively true.
Yes.
So in the gender, I'm glad you agree, but like in the gender debate, literally the point that I would make if I were debating a fourth waiver is men can't be women. Like, that's it. And I mean, I think most people that have been on a pleasant date or to an athletic tryout or something like that to the gym are very aware of some of the male-female differences. I mean, you don't have to list them in detail. It's just, I mean, like, you know, I could lose some weight, but like I'm a bro-y guy, weigh 200 pounds. I can grow a beard in a week. It's pretty obvious that I'm a man. If I were to put on a wig, declare myself female, and start trying to use the women's locker room, almost everyone would backlash in disgust. So when people start advocating for that, it becomes very obvious for most people to say, no, I've had enough of this. That's advantage 1. Advantage 2 would be that the people that are saying the same things are mostly also the people that have the ideas that promote survival, a moderate but real level of religiosity, some understanding of science, so on down the line. So like the having children pattern is not evenly distributed. The average Catholic family from the working class Irish and Hispanic neighborhood I grew up in has 3 kids. The average purple-haired radical from my old U of I probably has 0.2 kids. So, I mean, I would encourage the people that are doing normal things and saying normal things to live a normal life, almost ignore a lot of the nonsense, but when you're confronted by it, never pretend to believe it, knock it down as the gibberish it is.
Retweet. By the way, I have your Twitter. I found it. I dug it up, and I really enjoy your username. Will, WIL, underscore, DA, underscore, beast, 630. Will, da beast, 630. Is your Twitter. I think that's so funny. Okay, I know I said that was my last question, but because we're live streaming on YouTube and we do have some time, and because I have a staggering amount of curiosity, I'm going to ask you one final question, which is, okay, so we're talking about how we as a society, we're martyring ourselves. We're self-flagellating. It's so Christian. It's so funny that many of these woke individuals, they excoriate Christianity and they don't realize that they are the malignant outgrowth of it, with the victimization and the empathy and mercy being taken too far. So it's a very kind of culturally Christian, ironically, thing to do, to self-flagellate. When and why and how did this self-flagellation become a circus? I mean, you were just saying, when you said that our points are intuitively true, I was laughing because we forget that. We forget how absolutely obscene it is that we are having a conversation in dead seriousness about why a woman is a woman and a man is a man. When did this when, how, and why did this become so obscenely irrational and circus-like?
Well, as an academic, I actually think I can answer that question. Like, this comes out of the French philosophy of postmodernism and the second wave of deconstructionism that Dinesh D'Souza, back when he was an academic writer, or more of one, criticized in the 80s, maybe. So, I mean, like, the postmodernist is someone who believes that words create reality. And like, I actually, I think I'm a fairly funny, bantering writer, and I still like to play basketball and golf and so on. But thank you. But I also do try to do a decent number of fairly serious academic pieces, and this stuff is still out there. As with the extremes of Christianity, where you lose the 9 noble virtues and you just have empathy, I personally view this stuff as just nonsensical. You never want to take non-ultimate rules to ultimate extremes and pretend that the extreme you've reached is real. And this is a problem with excessive moralists. I believe Christians call this the vice of scrupulosity. So, like, you actually could not turn around to a wolf and say, you have no right to kill me, for example. That's a limit not only on religious morality, it's more of a limit on postmodernism, but blah, blah, blah. The postmodernist thinks words define reality. So gender ideology comes out of Judith Butler, women's studies, a couple male perverts as well, in specific years like 1985, 1986. The idea, as I understand it, is that there are 2 different things. Like, sex is what you are. You have a vagina or a penis. You're male or female. But a bunch of people, many of them French, obviously, around this time also started arguing that there are characteristics that you associate with masculinity or femininity. So in the canonical essay, the point was made that if you were a man, but you were gracile and very feminine, and you had long hair, and you preferred to make love with other men, and you were wearing a women's blouse, and you were wearing red lipstick, and so on, and you were in certain traditional societies, they might not understand that you were a man. The claim was that you would have female gender, that there's a thing called gender that exists differently from sex. So the argument became that someone could be female in sex, but male in gender. And I guess my response to this is that this is all just BS. You're just describing being a stereotypically feminine man. Someone in that category would just be gay or prince. There's not a new word that you need to describe it. But that's where gender theory came from. The gender claim is that someone who is male biologically, but feminine in gender terms, is a woman. And the second wave of gender theory is essentially the argument that gender is more important than sex. So someone who is female in gender terms, but male biologically, and here's where I don't understand the logic at all, but that person should, for example, go to female prison or play sports against women. And I think that most normal people just look at this and say, no, this argument makes no sense from the starting point. The fact that you're a little bit feminine and stylish doesn't make you a woman. And even if it does in some theoretical sense, which again, I don't buy, it doesn't mean you get to go to the women's jail, shut up, sit down, and take off that blouse. That's where I think, again, there's the advantage on our side. That's probably the 90% position.
What you just said reminded me of something I read in Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And I was honored to welcome Mr. Trueman to the show to discuss it. He opens the book by saying that the phrase, "I am a man trapped in a woman's body," synopsizes the modern world. And he said, if you went back, 40 years ago, and someone went to a doctor and said, "I am a man trapped in a woman's body," the doctor would say to them, "Okay, this is a problem with your mind, and your mind needs to be brought into accordance with your body." Today, if someone goes to the doctor and says, "I'm a man trapped in a woman's body," they say, "Okay, this is a problem with your body, and we need to change your body through puberty blockers and amputation and all these crazy things to bring it into accordance with your mind." That is exactly what you were saying, this French postmodernist, words are reality. My truth is reality, and it trumps the truth. That really is very enlightening. I got to do a show on French modernism. I'll email you and see if you'd be willing to recommend to me some books to really dive into this further. But thank you so much, Professor Riley, for your time today. And again, this book, if we can put up a photo of it, is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. All the best, Professor Riley. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me on.
All right, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed that episode, and it really is such a fantastic book. So necessary to read today. Sean, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you have some final thoughts, you can share them. If not, that is okay. We'll just piece it out here.
No, that was riveting from start to finish. What a fantastic guest.
He's so funny. A lot of professors can't combine the nerdiness and the funniness. He can. I really enjoyed that. So thank you all so much. I see that the chat was enjoying it. That's great news. I'll see you next week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, right here live on YouTube. Be sure to check out Dennis and Julie this Sunday at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, also on this YouTube channel. In the meantime, take care. I'll see you soon.